Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Conway Hall, where ethics matters. This afternoon, we've got something incredibly appropriate for Mother's Day. We've got Sally Howard, who combined history and fieldwork to write The Home Stretch. How did we get here? And what does the future look like for feminism's final frontier, the domestic labour gap? This has been thrown into incredibly sharp relief during the pandemic, with women assuming the third shifts, the so-called pink collar work. There's childcare, homeschooling, as well as all of the traditional work. Where do we go from here? So I'd like to introduce you to journalist and writer and speaker, Sally Howard. Sally, over to you.
Hello, thanks very much. I'm here with a little help from my unfeminist friends, as you'll see in the background. We're going to start with a quote. I struggle to feel that clutter in the home doesn't reflect poorly on my character. I have come to realise that the expectations I put on myself are unrealistic and reflect a value system I have long ago abandoned, but still I struggle, not least because in the country an uncluttered home is an impossibility. These complaints could have been penned by an 18th century parson's wife. They were written, however, by the founding member of a radical separatist community in Oregon, reflecting on the unexpected trials of 2 decades of feminist separatist living. Jean was amongst thousands of women across the West who were inspired by the women's movement to take part in a radical experiment in feminist living, or women's lands with a Y. At the point of writing in 1994, former housewife Jean had been living in Rootworks, the community she co-founded with her partner Ruth, in Southern Oregon for 16 years. At the women's movement's 1970s height, thousands of women lived in these intentional feminist communities, most of which were in the rural US and Mexico, but also Australia, New Zealand, and Western Europe. Loosely affiliated with the 60s wave of the Back to the Land movement, women's lands sought to establish practical ways of living beyond the oppressions of the patriarchy through rural self-sufficiency. Many women's lands inhabitants, the land dykes as they came to call themselves, were homosexual by political choice. The land dykes shared the belief that the pursuit of formal equality within the patriarchy was impossible, and that true autonomy for women, when it came to such matters as division of domestic labour, could only be achieved by breaking away from the capitalist patriarchal system and founding a new society in the absence of men. The first issue of Woman's Spirit, a magazine founded by Rootworks members, outlined their hopes. When we realise the political implications of all of our struggles, we know that patriarchy cannot withstand our changes and something is going to happen, it read. We are feeling stirrings inside us that tell us what we are making is nothing less than a new culture. The women's lands, which included the mystically named Rainbow's End, Ravensong, Stepping Woods and Flyaway Home communities, were a radical attempt to translate the insights of second-wave feminism into lived reality. Chores were allotted with painful egalitarianism, and dwellings were constructed simply to minimise the need for upkeep. The reality of founding new communities in hardscrabble rural locations was challenging. Land dykes found that some country locals were not keen on encampments of lesbians, and cheaply bought land could be tough to farm. Sustaining community finances was difficult, with many members forced to work for a wage and therefore within the patriarchal market economy they rejected. Tougher still, however, was shaking off the yoke of the good housewives they'd been raised in 50s America to become. We were very hard on ourselves with our idealistic politics, said former member Pelican Lee, looking back on the communes too in the 1990s. We could not emotionally handle living the ways we believed in politically. Our endless meetings trying to deal with everything in a politically correct way caused too much trauma and upheaval and eventually burned us out. Sisterhood then was not enough, and even working hard to work things out was not enough. Growing up in capitalist patriarchal America had not prepared us for living the kind of life we desired. The 1970s saw a real radical energy around the work then known as women's work, the mopping and brow wiping and bottom wiping ascribed to women on the basis of the shape of our genitals. This was the era in which the work was conceived of as reproductive labour. in contrast to Marxist constructions of productive labour, and when the women's liberation movement in the US marched bearing placards calling out the oppressions of this women's work. "Don't iron while the strike is hot" was a witty placard carried by marchers in New York on Women's Equality Day in August 1970. And on the same day in Detroit, women staged a guerrilla theatre in which they mutely washed dishes and doted on cardboard cutouts of husbands wearing heels and aprons. Activist Wages for Housework, meanwhile, made the radical demand that housework should be recognised as work and remunerated as such within a capitalist wage system. "Capital has made and does make money out of our cooking, smiling and fucking," said co-founder Silvia Federici. "The demand for wages shows that we have cooked, smiled and fucked throughout the years because we had no other choice." In part, my book was an inquiry into where this energy, this feminist attention had gone. Because all the work that second wave feminists called attention to as work hadn't gone anywhere. Bottoms still need to be wiped, floors swept and toilet bowls cleaned. Had this work, I wondered, simply become less problematic as heterosexual men answered second wave feminist demands and pitched in on the domestic front? By the time I was a teenager in the 1990s, British men were contributing an average of 19 hours a week of housework and childcare, compared to 1971 man's measly average of an hour and 30 minutes. This was the way I'd understood it as a child of the 80s and 90s, and maybe you did too. Feminist progress, the housework battle, was won. Some heterosexual men didn't notice dirt and disarray, sure, but we were on an upward path from stooped Neanderthal to Homo erectus millennial man with a squeegee in his hand. There's a quote from the two Spice Girls coming here as a warning. "No way we're going to stay at home and do washing up for some man," said the Spice Girls' Melanie Brown of Girl Power in 1998. "He can take me out for dinner." With Jerry Halliwell adding, in a similar vein, "We're freshening up feminism for the 90s and there's no need to burn your bra." As a young suburban Brummie, these narratives appealed to me. The battle was won, housework was an unsexy second wave feminist cause, I wouldn't be found weeping 20 years hence with my arm down the toilet bowl. It was only with motherhood that the ghosts of housewifery struggled up the kitchen pipes and grabbed me with their marigolds. In the book, I call it the parent labour trap. The fact that the birth of a child increases the unpaid work demanded of a couple by several hours a day, and that in heterosexual couples, these extra work hours, the relentless laundry and the strewn toys, falls to women. 2 hours of additional work falls to women compared to an additional 40 minutes for men, or an effort gap the length of an average movie. Much of this, rather than being down to men unilaterally downing tools when they spawn life, is structural. Despite being a legal right since 2015, few British couples take up the offer of shared parental leave, the model favoured in Sweden and Denmark, where there's a use it or lose it state-funded quota of father's leave. This means that mothers are almost uniformly primary carers in the early years. Mothers develop the expertise around hands-on parenting, as men are awarded the daddy bonus of pay rises and increased hours. Many women therefore see their careers stall, whether or not they've requested, as it's known in corporate parlance, the mummy track, or they struggle with the double shift with its risks of burnout and poor mental health. As women's careers stall, our bargaining power reduces, and decisions are made within heterosexual families to prioritise the wage-earning job, which further retrenches the power imbalances. Parenthood, I was shocked to discover, animates the patriarchal capitalism many childless heterosexual women think they've evaded, battles we think have been won. As 80s and 90s mainstream feminism disavowed the ideas of the second wave, it concerned itself with cultural representations, political representations of beauty, sexuality, and postmodernist deconstructions of the category of women, all vital work. Who pulled the rubbery spaghetti strands out of the sink plug, however, seemed less so. Despite the gains in male effort we saw in the 80s and 90s, Homo erectus with his squeegee remains elusive. In the UK's Office for National Statistics survey in 2016, British men contributed an average of 18 hours a week of domestic effort to British women's 36 hours, a 60% effort gap. It's a similarly lopsided picture around the world. In the US, men contribute 7 hours a week to women's 17, French men 10 to French women's 20, Australian women's 15 to Australian men's 5, women in Italy devote 24.5 hours a week to men's 3.5, and Portuguese men rouse themselves for fewer than 3 hours a week to Portuguese women's 22. I was shocked to find that even in Sweden, where gender equality is a government project, women put in 45 minutes a day more on average than their male counterparts. There have, of course, been improvements since the advent of second wave feminism. But what was worse was that after 2 decades of gains from the 70s to 90s, and somewhere around the time the Spice Girls were topping the charts, these figures went into reverse. Indeed, today's 30 and 40-something male Britons put in almost 2 fewer hours a week core housework, that's excluding childcare, than their similarly aged counterparts did in 1998. And in the US, it's similar, with US men reducing their input over this period by an hour a week. Increasingly, the work the second wave feminists dubbed shit work was passed down a gendered, classed and raced hierarchy. The hand that pushed the sponge and thrust the brush in the UK was still invariably female. But from the mid-80s, in Britain's middle class homes, it was as likely to be the hand of a lowly paid migrant woman as an unpaid spouse. At the outbreak of the pandemic, Britons paid other people to clean their homes, city dwellers mainly, at a rate not seen since the end of wide-scale domestic servitude in the 30s. From 2015 to 2018, I joined the burgeoning ranks of Londoners who contracted a weekly cleaner. The day my cleaner Tanya used to visit, I'd return home to the smell of Dettol mixed with Tanya's sweat, a clean kitchen, a bathroom, and a drenching sense of guilt. Part of my book was an inquiry too into this guilt. After all, many putatively feminist friends told me that here was the answer to the domestic labour gap. Men didn't pitch in, but you could pay a cleaner, and it was the ideal feminist fix. It made the labour real by giving it a price and bringing it into market capitalism. In writing this book, however, I came to realise that if we want to argue for this economic point, we need to follow it through to its conclusion, paying any domestic workers well and offering them sickness and holiday pay. One feminist academic computed the fair exchange price of a cleaner as follows. An average UK employee earns £518 each week for working an average of 37 hours. Accounting for lunch breaks and statutory paid leave, to which a cleaner is generally not entitled, this means that an average person earns £18.14 per actual working hour. Adding in £3 to return bus fare, a cleaner should therefore be paid £21.14 to clean for an hour, or £39.28 for a 2-hour session, and more for those based in London. The average cleaner in London, however, earns just £8.89 an hour, as the pandemic has also shown up the precariousness of their roles. Many domestic cleaners were let go with no notice as the pandemic struck, or were forced to work with no protective equipment, cleansing surfaces that might harbour coronavirus, or indeed commissioned to clean offices where there had been a recent outbreak. Enter into this picture of asymmetrical labour and of unethical fixes to the gender labour gap, the pandemic. The pandemic, of course, has wrought a grim toll across the world, costing millions of lives and many more livelihoods. Men are more likely to die of the virus, but it's women who've borne the brunt of its social impact. With breathtaking speed, the pandemic ripped up dual earners' fragile compact. We can both work because there is someone else to look after the kids and maybe scrub the loo. Last March, there was no one to look after the kids, no one to school the kids, no one to supply the tens of meals a week that Britain consumed away from home before the pandemic struck. The economy and many public services were shuttered, and women, as we have in crises before, were left to pick up the slack. A few months down the line, the immediate effects of this system shock became clear. Only 36% of British women have been able to continue working full-time alongside their caring responsibilities during the pandemic, compared to 66% of men. And mothers are more likely to have quit or lost their job than other groups since the pandemic began. Being a high-earning woman was no inoculation, it seemed, against the pandemic's third shift, with a study released last Friday showing that lower-paid mothers did double the amount of housework and 41% more childcare than higher-paid fathers during lockdowns, while higher-paid mothers also pitched in more, doing 6% more housework and 22% more childcare than lower-paid fathers. An Institute for Fiscal Studies survey last summer showed that women were more likely to have been trying to work while simultaneously caring for children during lockdowns, and they were twice as likely to be interrupted as men while attempting to work from home. Dropping out of the jobs market can, we know, scar women's career paths as it increases women's risk of falling victim to domestic violence. As the pandemic recedes over a nation of shattered women, change, it seems, is overdue. At this point, some wit, usually a male wit, will say to me, what about technology? What about the robot maids and the vacuum cleaners and dishwashers and intelligent homes and AI fridges that can stock up on butter when you've run out? Will the bright new future of technological process do away with the drudgery of housework forever, making these arguments, this battle, in fact, obsolete? Well, these have long been the promises of capitalism, from the washing machines that replaced the rattling twin tubs my grandmother used, and the twin tubs that replaced the back-breaking washboards and mangles. But sadly, the big labour-saving breakthroughs, piped water and electrification, which did away with centuries of lighting up and water carrying, have been and gone. History perversely has also shown us that each sequential wave of technology, as it crashes into the patriarchy, has in fact both raised standards and brought in new feminized categories of labour. The whiter than white shirt, and now the digital labour of managing the self-ordering fridge when it goes haywire and orders 90 tubs of Lurpak. Housework will always require mental effort and elbow grease. So if robots aren't to save us, what is? The pandemic, I argue, is a moment of potential recognition and renewal. Many of us in the past year have stewed in our domestic compromises and fixes, in dwellings ill-fitted to function as simultaneous creches, offices and homes. Many men have contributed more in absolute terms to childcare. We've all realised that the fragile fixes the market had come to provide in lieu of anti-sexist structures, such as fully funded early years childcare, are just that, fragile and unsustainable fixes. There's been a renewed appreciation for the vital labour often dubbed pink-collar work, domiciliary care, nursing and cleaning, and this appreciation should, and I hope will, outlive this health crisis. Many of us have realised that the nuclear family dwellings we live in, 3-bed semis designed to be staffed by a full-time labour force of one at her kitchen sink as she observes the kids playing in the garden beyond, reinforce inequalities as they reinscribe sexism. They are also woefully environmentally inefficient as they privatise many aspects of reproduction that could be managed communally. In 1930s Manhattan, apartment blocks were built with dumbwaiters to ferry food from individual units, or rather 2 individual units from centralised kitchens. And in Vienna in the same era, apartments were designed around communal nurseries and laundries. These ideas for communalisation were once unradical and everyday. There are further reasons we need a renewed feminist effort around what happens behind closed domestic doors. Domestic labour has become yet another terrain for a polarised culture war in which the right is coalescing around traditional and binarised gender roles and pitching these roles as solutions to modern women's unhappy husbandless and ennui. We're seeing the rise of social media movements such as submissive and trad wives, which we can talk about in Q&A. And we have seen the rise of macho populist male leaders, Bolsonaro, Trump, who boast about never having pushed a pram or changed a nappy. More worryingly, perhaps, Generation Z, raised by double-shifting mothers, appear to have become disillusioned about the possibility of equality at home. In 1994, 42% of American high school seniors aged 18 agreed that the best kind of family was one in which the man was the provider and the woman took care of the home. In 2014, however, 58% of surveyed 18-year-olds believed this was true. Further, 60% of the latter cohort believe working mothers could not establish as warm and secure a relationship with their children, compared to 48% of their 90s counterparts. Studies in the UK have picked up on a similar trend. Clearly, some sort of retreat from liberal attitudes towards the home, at least regarding the role of mothers, is underway. This new mood has been dubbed egalitarian essentialism, which US historian Stephanie Kuntz describes as follows: a commitment to equality of opportunity with the belief that women and men typically choose different opportunities because men are inherently better suited to some roles and women to others. These are the children of the double shifting women who putatively had it all, and this should worry us. The feminist revolution stalled at the kitchen sink, but I argue in this book that we can restart this revolution, and the backsliding we've seen in the pandemic, and with the populist essentialist backlash that preceded it, makes it an ever more urgent task. I'm often asked by exhausted heterosexual mothers for the silver bullet that will make their male partners pitch in more. When it comes to structural power imbalances and an inheritance of centuries of rigid gender roles, there is, I'm afraid, no quick fix. There is no chore chart or regime that will open men's eyes to categories of invisible labour or make heterosexual households with lopsided housework regimes egalitarian overnight, though chore charts can and do help. But there are reasons to be hopeful. Applications to British communes have quadrupled since the pandemic began, as Diggers and Dreamers, a network of alternative and eco-communities, has also seen membership boom. The rise of mutual aid and allotmenting has taught us the value of community and socialisation of effort. The US, meanwhile, is seeing the flowering of queer lands, the inheritors of women's lands, where radical communitarianism combines with Wi-Fi, kinder rural topographies, and gender and trans inclusivity. The Women's Land showed us that radical projects aren't easy and are always marginal. Aspirations are often constrained by gender socialisation and resistant class structures. Too often in women's lands, it was working class women who ended up performing the shit work. But we are once more finding space to reimagine our domestic arrangements, and that's good news. The events and anger following the murder of Sarah Everard show us there's an appetite for change and too for direct feminist action. Tomorrow, women will establish a rolling protest outside Scotland Yard against the police's dismissal of street harassment and the fact that only 1.7% of reported rapes in England and Wales go prosecuted. The era of the overarching lifestyle as ideology may have gone. There is no one counterculture, and there is no one cohesive feminism. But we are once more daring to dream. Housework, childcare, and pink-collar labour are, for the first time in decades, topping the feminist agenda, and that's a reason too to take heart. The feminist revolution stalled at the kitchen sink, and if we restart this revolution, it will be good news. Good news for the men who'd like to stay at home with their newborn infants, but feel stigmatised out of devalued women's work. Good news for the many women working the double and now triple shift. Good news for those working for poverty wages in the pink-collar sector. Good news for the children of heterosexual parents who suffer the emotional toll of their parents arguing about housework, as studies show. We can push for women's quotas and naming and shaming the gender pay gap, but if we don't address what's happening behind closed doors, our hopes for equality of opportunity will also prove an impossible dream. As one feminist epithet puts it, it's not the glass ceiling, it's the sicky floor, stupid.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I don't fancy moving to Portugal anymore. That seemed to have the biggest differentiation.
It did. It's a big disparity, isn't it? With Portugal.
I do remember hearing once that the biggest thing that the feminist revolution had achieved was that men now thought they did more housework than they thought they did before. So yes, I'm sure there are a lot of perceptions and everything here too. We're now open for Q&A. So if anyone would like to ask Sally a question, please do. We've had a couple of technical difficulties in the past. Sometimes if you have an old version of Zoom, people have tried to speak and they couldn't quite get through. In that case, I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf, or if you just don't like appearing on Zoom and would like me to ask it, that's absolutely fine too. So just put your Q's and A's in the Q&A section. I'd like to start actually, Sally. I remember a friend of mine, probably, well, many years ago now, had said that for him the big problem was that women couldn't do housework and that they were sort of shunted off to work. And I kind of grasped what he meant as soon as I realised our differences in class background, because my mum had been a nurse, so she'd had some professional background. There was prestige in what she did. He came from a really working class East End family, and his mum had gone off to do a boring job for money. And so is there a class element in all of this?
I mean, you know, indubitably so, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of kind of, it's very much a sort of intersectional issue, but I wouldn't say that there's necessarily these days a class element around the desire for egalitarian setups. I mean, there are some quite depressing studies in the States which show that women from very marginalized backgrounds would say that one of the reasons that they actually give up on being with the fathers of their children because the men that in the pool that they sort of shop for husbands are relentlessly macho, and there's just no way of finding an egalitarian union. And that's obviously gender scripts are very different in very quarters. And one of the things that you find with the sort of resurgent traditionalism is this sense that, yes, it's a badge of honor to have those binarized roles and to be able to afford it. And actually, frankly, especially within the quarters where the tradwise movement is growing up, it can't be afforded. So it is very interesting. It's becoming this sort of aspiration. But, you know, even when women ascribe to traditionalism, whatever that category of traditionalism means for them, the second shift or, you know, disproportionate shouldering of this labor, it has a poor psychological effect. I mean, people often say to me, if, you know, I've been on talk, you know, on radio debates with women who are from a different viewpoint and say, you know, what if I enjoy gathering fruit with my son? You're taking that away from me. and you know, obviously there are different categories of domestic labour. The things we all find enjoyable. I mean, you know, during lockdown I've been baking wartime pies, but that does not mean that I want to, you know, be making sort of, you know, it's the everydayness and the fact that, you know, despite the kind of pleasantness of some of these tasks, when they all fall to someone on the basis of, you know, as I say, the shape of their genitals, it becomes, you know, a burden and can become quite grueling.
Yeah, I get embarrassed when I have to admit that I like ironing.
Ironing can be therapeutic, you know, it's all the power structures within which you iron.
He's not getting my iron off me, forget it.
It can also be a weapon, unfortunately, but yeah.
We've got an inquiry here. Can you tell us about the new movements? I'm aware of them in the United States, not anywhere else. The kind of new traditionalist movements.
So I mean, it was quite interesting because I kind of broke the tradwife story here in a story that I wrote in a sort of millennial women's magazine, and it's something that's much more pronounced in the States, where after, you know, around the time of the second wave feminism sort of theories were coming out, there was a book that was a kind of a counterpoint to the feminine mystique that was about the what's it called, the feminine woman, and it was written by a kind of Mormon mother of 8 to say, you're all wrong, feminists. Actually, the only way we're going to be happy is if women follow the kind of biblically ascribed obviously they're not really in the Bible, the idea of wearing ruffles around your neck, but it was that idea of it's got to be these binarized roles are the thing that make you as a man and woman happy. So that came up at the same time. It's always been bubbling up alongside, and now it's patched into the sort of QAnon sort of radical far right. So you have quite a raced element, actually. There's this idea strand to the sort of trad wives and surrendering movement, which is about how women should surrender to men. That's very much about kind of repopulating the states as a sort of, you know, white women due to feminism aren't having white children. There's a dark element to it, but there's also a kind of lighter social media pop cultural element. The trad wives who, you know, enjoy dressing up, as we see behind me, in kind of retro clothing, and there's a lightness to that, but then there's also you know, a political thread that goes through it that says, you know, this is why, you know, this is why women are unhappy, because I mean, I don't see the evidence that women are unhappy, but this is why women are happy because they can't get husbands, because they're, you know, eschewing their natural role. And this is, you know, I mean, you can oversell it, because you can look at some hashtags and think, wow, it's a massive cohort, but it exists, it does exist, and it is exhibiting appeal. And you also have you know, sort of feminist sort of deconditioning experts, and, you know, it's quite a kind of worrying time, actually, around this sort of this backlash. This backlash is quite pronounced.
Because it's just one of a great many kind of backlashes that we're going through. My mum always said, oh, I don't like this feminism nonsense. I preferred it when women were superior. But of course, you have to live with incredibly benign men to have experienced it that way around.
Yeah, and there's a very kind of prominent sort of strand of, you know, especially around sort of sexual and street harassment in mainland Europe, that is the sort of, you know, I'd say the kind of retro severe rank type school that says, oh, darling, just bat his hand away. And within that is such an implication of the power structure, or the position, the expectation that you have power in these scenarios. And that's why I think, you know, that the moment that we're having now around the kind of clarity of an acknowledgement of street harassment is really important, and unfortunately already another terrain for the culture war.
I've got another one here. So he says, is it possible that this is an issue to do with us simply also gaining too much of our identity from a conventional workplace, in that women feel like, no, actually, that men feel like they lose their identities when they can't let their careers go a little bit? Is this really a sort of a very counter thing?
I mean, you know, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that we don't see a huge pickup of shared parental leave, and that men, you know, even don't really take their kind of 2 weeks of leave, because there's huge amounts of sort of social pressure, and, you know, the off the peg identity that a man gets, and especially that's really sort of reinforced, and he gets rewarded when he's a father, and is seen, you know, and begins to be given pay rises and additional work. So yeah, I mean, there's a huge stigma, and, you know, I didn't include it in the book, but I did quite a lot of work with men who worked in early years childcare, and there was a man I interviewed who worked at a kind of cooperative nursery in Hackney, and he said, you know, I really love this work, but mothers have come to me and said, you know, have complained about me and inferred I'm a paedophile because I'm working in early years childcare. And, you know, we all, I don't know, we all kind of, you know, we all sort of support and reinforce these sorts of male identities, and, you know, really,
that breaks my heart, because some of the most influential people when I was younger were male teachers, and they were outnumbered by, you know, a vast amount, but probably for the kind of reasons that you said. But that's peculiar for children to grow up thinking that 100% of the authoritative figures in their lives are female, because the teachers aren't.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, we are seeing actually in nursing there's a little bit of a shift, but the men within nursing tend to be in the, you know, the sort of emergency side. They seem to be sort of controlling crowds in A&E. And even which obviously the sort of I spent time with many cleaners for this book, many domestic cleaners, and only about sort of 6-7% of domestic cleaners and actually cleaners in offices are men. And hilariously, I sort of say, and it's, automatically when they're kind of cleaning offices, men take up the big equipment. They do the sort of, the big kind of carpet equipment. And it's like, even in these sort of, but this, it is important to get to this position where, male identities are less constrained. Because it has a damaging effect on all of it.
Men are people too.
Yeah. And I mean, I in terms of that really key intervention in terms of shared parental leave, I think what's been shown to work is the Scandinavian model, where there's a use it or lose it quota, because otherwise everything from the fact that men earn more to kind of social pressure to the fact that companies just don't see you as sort of serious if you're on the kind of beta daddy track, conspire to stop men taking that. And then that, it's a tragedy, I think.
I have another one here. What are your thoughts about the trend of mummy bloggers or mum influencers on social media?
Yes, I mean, I've got a chapter in my book about that, so you'll have to read all about it. And it's just, amazing. It's such a huge market that in the States they have like the Mummy Blogger 2.0 Summit, this massive sort of, thousands and thousands of people. I mean, I see it very much through a capitalist lens, that it's, arch capitalism kind of commodifying this and creating this sort of glossy, sort of external, unattainable reality that often involves, a lot of labour, a lot of kind of invisibilised labour. And I sort of talk about one of the mummy bloggers who just lost her mind and said that unfortunately, it got to the level where her life was being conditioned by advertisers, and they were saying, we want your son to, eat berries and wear these wellies. And I don't see it as a malevolent force as some people do, but it's just capitalism run wild across motherhood, and probably unsurprising.
Yeah, there's only so much time you can invest on looking good for Instagram, I suppose, if you want to stay sane. We have a question here from Terry Laurel Anderson. She asks, what's the name of the book? And I can tell you it's called The Home Stretch. The Home Stretch, or Why the Gender Revolution Stalled at the Kitchen Sink. I mean, the home stretch talks about, it works a few ways. It hopes that we're on the home stretch and we're going to restart this feminist revolution. Well, Sally, it's been absolutely brilliant to speak to you. Thank you ever so much. It's been fascinating. It's something that we all experience. It's something that happens to us all the time, but for somebody to have gone into it in detail like this is really, really great. Thank you so much. Sure. And thank you to all of the people who have joined us this afternoon for this talk as well. Remember that Conway Hall has been as shut as everything else has been for the last year, and that it does really good work, and we depend on your donations. So if you have any free money, a little bit of spare, please do donate it to us. And we hope to see you actually in the building at some point this year when we're allowed to open back up again. Thank you very much, Sally, and goodbye. Thank you very much.